Goeiedag, mijn naam is Evan, ik ben immigratieprocureur hier in Amerika en ik wil jou helpen om immigratiewet te verstaan. Now, never in a million years did I think I would be making two videos on Jeffrey Epstein and the Afrikaner Refugee program. If you're new to my channel, I actually talked about this a couple of months ago, but since there are so many new viewers and since there has been new news in the Jeffrey Epstein issue news cycle, I thought it would be relevant to make this video again. So if you are new to the channel, remember to like, subscribe, share. If you are a subscriber, consider becoming a channel member. It really helps the work that I do, which is to help Afrikaner refugees who are trying to go through the refugee program inside Africa, as well as to help Afrikaners here in the United States who are seeking asylum, and to educate the American public on the persecution of Afrikaners inside Africa. So the concern that comes from the Afrikaner community with Jeffrey Epstein is what could possibly happen to President Trump. And that's not an irrational concern, because as many of you had seen and know, that as soon as Trump was inaugurated and became president again, he immediately ended all refugee programs. And this was part of his campaigning promises to revamp and to change and to correct our broken immigration system. And one of that, as you've seen, as you go through this refugee program, is there were many subcontractors and government contractors that worked with USRAP and the whole refugee cycle that were, for the most part, just taking government money, not doing anything with it. So the America First philosophy, this program needed to be revamped. So President Trump stopped all refugee programs, then to create the Afrikaner Refugee program and open it up to helping y'all find South Africa. So you can see that the president has broad sweeping authority when it comes to controlling any sort of immigration, refugee, asylee program. So if there was a change in administration, there absolutely could be an instantaneous stop to the Afrikaner Refugee program. But let's cross that bridge when we get to it. Let me first explain to you a few things. One, this whole thing with Jeffrey Epstein and what might happen to President Trump, let's be realistic here. Nothing is going to happen to President Trump. So we can put that aside. And even if it did, again, we'll discuss that in a second. You have to understand, President Trump has been impeached twice. Impeachment is not removal from office. Removal from office is the second step in that whole impeachment process. To be impeached, you're impeached by the House of Representatives. It's kind of like an official slap on the wrist that forever follows your record. So President Trump will forever be known as having been impeached twice. However, after you're impeached by the House of Representatives, it then goes to the Senate. And the Senate becomes the jury in a trial. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court will actually preside at the head of the Senate, and they will put on a trial to decide whether or not to remove the president from office. And that has never happened. And it will probably, and the world's so crazy at this point, I don't want to say, absolutes, but it's not going to happen, okay? One, the Republicans control both the House and the Senate. It's never happened before. It's never going to happen. And you have to be impeached for committing high crimes and misdemeanors, which again is something that has never traditionally been defined. There are so many issues here that I don't even want to waste the time to discuss it, because we're really talking hypotheticals here. One, all the stuff that has come up about Epstein hasn't implicated Trump as doing anything. In fact, if you actually look at it, it's absolved him of doing a whole lot of things. So that's apples and oranges. It's meaningless. I don't want you to be concerned. I just wanted to let you know that the process for removing a president from office is the second step in the impeachment process, and it is very difficult to do. But that just being said, whether President Trump is removed from office, which he won't be, or whether a new administration from the left, from the Democratic Party, takes over at the next election cycle, that is something that, well, what if it happens? How does it concern me as an Afrikaner refugee? You have to understand, refugees, as of right now, are not being sent back. There is something called the non-refoulement principle. What that means is that once someone has been accepted as a refugee, it is the international law that has been adopted by the United States from the United Nations that we do not send refugees back to countries where they fled from that fear of persecution. Threats to life, liberty, all the examples that I've given you before. So what would have to happen is the new administration would, one, have to stop the refugee program. So if you're still inside Africa, that would unfortunately end it for you. But if you were here in the United States, they would then have to make the argument that the conditions have fundamentally changed to the point where sending you back would not put you in a position where you'd face persecution. Now, let's be honest here. If a leftist administration took charge, they would just declare it and that would be it. As you know, a leftist administration would cozy up to the communist, socialist, ANC, and EFF and all the other nonsense groups in South Africa. So, unfortunately, it looks realistic that that could possibly happen. But again, there's a process to this, right? The government would have to acknowledge that the persecutor and the fear of persecution is no longer genuine, it no longer exists, and then, in theory, refugees could be sent back. However, let's look at refugee programs and what's been happening here in the United States. If you come here as a refugee during the Trump administration, so you've still got 3 years left, right? After a year of being a refugee, you lose your refugee status and you apply and you become a lawful permanent resident. That's when you get a green card. That's what it means. You're now a lawful permanent resident of the United States. At that point, the refugee program no longer applies to you. So all of the refugees who have come or are coming now, after a year from your arrival, when you become a lawful permanent resident, it doesn't matter what happens in South Africa. It doesn't matter what happens with the president. None of that matters at all because you are no longer considered under the refugee program. You are now a lawful permanent resident. And can LPRs be returned to their home country? Yes, but for very different reasons, right? None of which would be applicable to y'all here as contributing members to society, to the United States. So I just wanted to throw that out there because whenever again, I could care less about the Epstein thing, all of this. There's so much going on right now that I don't sit here and go over it, but people were asking me, well, what happens if Trump gets impeached? What happens if Trump loses the election? What happens? All of this. There's your answer. There's your answer. The ending of the refugee program should always be a concern. Because even if President Trump wanted to, he could technically, in theory, just end it on a whim, right? I don't think he's going to. That's not an issue. Let's not even be afraid of that. But let's always be cognizant of the things that could possibly happen. So a new administration could come in and absolutely end the refugee program. Could they send refugees back? In theory, yes, but they would then have to declare, and I say prove because they would just say that it is, that the threat of persecution is no longer there, so that they don't violate the non-refoulement principle of refugee programs. So people who are still under refugee status could be returned to South Africa. However, anyone who's been here for over a year in the refugee program, which in the current Trump administration, if he keeps the refugee program open, gives you 3 years, after a year, you're no longer a refugee. So you're not going to be sent back as a lawful permanent resident. So that fear should be gone, right? But again, let's just be honest that none of these things last forever. None of these programs, if the left does take over the next administration, it is a legitimate concern that the program will end and that they could consider declaring that the persecution is no longer viable, it's no longer well-founded, and people who are still in the refugee status could, in theory, be returned to South Africa. But again, I have a theory, or I have a way of life when it comes to law and all of this. I don't worry about a problem until it's a problem. Because once it's a problem, then we can figure out how to deal with it. But to worry about something before it's a problem is a waste of time and effort and energy when there are real problems right now that y'all are going through. Like the waiting for the refugee program, being called for interviews, all of that sort of stuff. So let's put the worry about Trump and Epstein aside, right? Because I've told you what could happen. Let's put the worry about the end of the Trump administration in 3 years aside, because that's 3 years away, and focus on the problems that are directly in front of us, which is all these little nuances of the refugee program that you're going through and for the asylum seekers here in the United States. So I hope that helps explain what could happen with a new administration, what could happen about returning refugees, the whole concept of the non-refoulement principle, and maybe this helps you better understand how this process works. So as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.